Hello everybody and welcome to Death of a Salesman, Part 1. So this is just going to be a quick summary and some points to look out for. So on today's agenda we have Acts 1, Part 1 through Part 4. We have character charts, occupations, Ben, and some final takeaways. So let's get started. So, starting off strong on Act 1, Part 1, we get introduced to our main character, Willie Loman, who is a traveling salesman in his 60s who just comes home. His wife, Linda, asks him if he's gotten into an accident, so we realize that Willie has a history of driving off-roads, both literary and figuratively. He is sort of falling into a trance. So we realize that our main character might not be as reliable as we maybe thought at the very beginning. Linda urges Willie to ask his boss to keep him working nearby. So we realize that Linda is an anchor for Willie. This is very important in their relationship because Linda will always go out of her way to do what is best for Willie. So we sort of see how these two characters are connected. Willie and Linda's two adult sons, Biff and Happy, who are 34 and 32, are visiting Part 1, and Willie has displayed signs of being angered at Biff, and we realize that earlier he chastised Biff for having a manual labor job instead of what he deems to be a real job like himself and Happy. So from the very beginning, we see that Willie declares that Biff is lazy, and this becomes very important later on. So a little bit on the character chart. We have Linda Loman, who is the main anchor. She is the housewife. She takes care of everybody, and everything sort of surrounds her. Her husband, Willie Loman, is our main character, and they have two children, Happy and Biff. Happy is a manager, while Biff is a ranch worker. Biff is friends with Bernard, who is a lawyer, and his father, Charlie, is a businessman who is also friends with Willie. Willie's brother, Ben, was an adventurer, and we sort of see him in hallucinations where Biff talks about getting rich, and we see what Ben sort of symbolizes for Willie. And lastly, we have the woman, which is Willie's secret lover, and we'll get a little bit into her later. Act 1, Part 1 continued. So, Biff and Happy start reminiscing about their childhood. Biff, we realize, used to be their father's favorite because of his previous successful football career. But recently, he has become more of a disappointment. So Happy becomes concerned with Willie talking to himself in the kitchen as he's talking to Biff, because he is addressing Biff while Biff is not really there. So they sort of witness their father for the first time in this state of delusion. Biff asks his father, and he says that he's going to see his old boss for a loan to build a ranch, which is sort of the beginning of what we see as Biff's true passions in life. And Happy encourages his brother, saying that Biff is well-liked, which, as we can see from the very beginning, is the opposite of what Willie thinks of Biff when he says that Biff is lazy. A little bit on occupations. We know that Willie is a salesman, but most importantly, this is very important, he values success above all else. So we see how his perception of success affects his relationships with other people. So for example, he approves of Happy's job. So that's why his relationship with Happy is very different than his relationship with Biff. Because Biff jumps from job to job with very little money, and that's why from the very beginning, Willie sees him as a disappointment. So every single thing that Willie does is through his values of success. Act 1, Part 2. So we see Willie getting further lost in his hallucinations, and we go back to when the boys were young. And we realize that the boys used to admire their father. And we sort of get this glimpse back in time of what things used to be. So Happy then tries to get his father's attention, but Willie only pays attention to Biff. This is very important to note, because while he was in his hallucination, he was back to the time where the boys admired him, which is back when Biff used to be a really good football player, which is why Willie only pays attention to Biff. So we sort of see his hallucinations bleed in to real life. Willie then brags that he is more well liked, which is exactly the opposite of what we saw earlier. And further, he tells Linda that he makes $1,200 that week when he really only made $200. So we see how these lies all come from a place of denial on where he is in life and where he thought he would be by then. He criticizes himself, so we sort of get a glance of Willie's own self-hatred, and we first hear of the woman's laughter. So, Act 1, Part 3, we see a little bit of the woman who is a secretary that Willie is having an affair with. An important thing to note here is that this is where he really begins to feel guilty. He sees Linda stitching stockings back together while he is gifting the woman these stockings. So, while being in his hallucinations, not only does he realize the good parts of his life, he also begins to feel really, really guilty about what he's done. And he sort of realized the comparisons that he made between Bernard and Biff. When Biff was told that he must study or risk not graduating, this was a direct comparison to Charlie's son. So Linda, again, tells Willie that Biff is too rough with certain daughters, and he says that some mothers worry about Biff. So here Willie becomes furious again with Biff. So we see that Willie is jumping back and forth, right? He's jumping from being super proud of Biff to being disappointed, to being proud, to being disappointed, depending on which hallucination and which experience he's having. So we see him as a very unstable character, especially in Part 3 of this play. Act 1, Part 3 continued. His hallucination ends, and Willie complains to Happy that he didn't go to Alaska with his brother. So now we see that Willie realizes that he's not that successful. He's not as successful as he thought he would be. So instead, he thinks about this get-rich-quick scheme that apparently his brother Ben had. So he starts wishing that he was like Ben. He starts wishing that he went to Alaska. He got rich quick through some scheme, and his sort of values of success emphasize this a lot. So this is very important with how he views his brother. Charlie comes over to play cards briefly, and Willie accuses him of cheating. So we start to see how Willie feels really, really guilty about what he did to Linda. So instead of acknowledging that, he accuses Charlie of cheating at a card game, which sort of points out his own cheating in his own life. But he doesn't really seem to realize that. So that's why Charlie really takes that into offense and gets weirded out. So let's finally talk about Ben. Let's realize that Ben is a father figure to Willie. And this is really strange, but their father left when Willie was only 4. So naturally, when Ben was 17, he would become more like a father figure to Willie. So instead of viewing hard work as being a pathway to being well-liked, Willie has that completely reversed. So he thinks that being well-liked would get him to be super rich and super successful. So this is sort of why he even picked being salesman as a job in the first place. So we sort of see the contrast between Willie's passions and his admirations. Willie hallucinates that Ben returns, and Ben wrestles with Biff in a manly showdown, which is quite unexpected, and Willie begs Ben to stay longer, but Ben says that he has to catch a train. So this is Ben sort of departing from Willie's mind. Willie is realizing that he is not Ben, he is not successful, he is not rich, and he falls deeper and deeper into this self-loathing hole where he realizes that maybe his career isn't exactly where he thought it would be based on his past experiences. Act 1, Part 4, we see a little bit of Willie hallucinating outside. So this is very important to note because before we only saw Willie hallucinating in his house, but now this is sort of spreading everywhere else. And Linda sees this and she's really worried. So she exposes him for lying about the money. She exposes him for attempting to commit suicide. And Willie begins in the stage of denial, where he's failing in the business world. So because of his values of success, failing in the business world would make him a failure, and he would rather die than be a failure. So we sort of see how this particular belief stems into his attempts to commit suicide and sort of what Willie values as a character. So the idea was that Biff wanted to start a new sports equipment business, and Willie tries to give Biff some pointers about that, but keeps contradicting himself. So not only is he contradicting himself when it comes to their relationships, he's now contradicting himself when it comes to businesses, which is why we see him failing in the business world. Then Linda tries to offer support, as she always does, but Willie tells her to shut up. So this is very, very, very important to note, because not only does Willie not acknowledge what Linda does for him, he, instead of feeling more compassionate to her after the cheating, he becomes more reserved. And we see this in his hidings of attempting to commit suicide, and we sort of see why Linda is afraid to do anything because of Willie's anger. So, some major takeaways. We see that Willie Loman values material success. We see that he is extremely prideful, and that when he is prideful, Biff is his favorite son because his image of himself is embodied in Biff. And when he feels like a failure, he views Biff as a failure. He is very disappointed in Biff, and he's guilty about his affair in the past. So Biff doesn't crave the type of success that his father craves. So he wants to be outside, he wants to work with his hands, and he realizes that this is exactly the passion that Willie has, that he's been suppressing all of this time. And he realizes that Willie's job as a salesman came from his admiration of Ben. And he didn't know this prior because he wasn't aware that his father was unwell until he actually heard him talking to himself. So, Death of a Salesman, 1985. Highly recommend. It follows the book 100%. And if you really like this, you will enjoy the play. You will enjoy it because it follows the book and is a great way to visualize what's going on. And come back for part 2 where we discuss the second half of the book. Thank you everybody for watching, and see you next time.